This paper could be titled "Reflections of an Old Biographer," because I've been working on the subject of Lawrence off and on for a long time. So, what I just want to do, having got my papers out of this thing, which will block me the whole way. Many people today assume that Lawrence owes his fame to David Lean's film Lawrence of Arabia, and for younger people that's probably true. But in fact he was already a celebrity in his lifetime. According to his bibliographer, by 1962, when the film appeared, more than 40 books had been published about him, of which 22, just over half, were written in English and 19 in other languages. Those other languages range from French, German and Italian through to Japanese, Turkish and even Yiddish. By 1998, those numbers had risen to around 73 publications in English and 54 in other languages. I don't have the current figure, but it will be much more than that. Despite all this attention, a biography by Scott Anderson published in 2013 claimed that Lawrence remains one of the most enigmatic and controversial figures of the 20th century. That statement seems to me a little extreme, but it isn't entirely absurd. So if there is some truth in it, why? Are there general problems that apply to all biographical subjects, or are these specific to Lawrence? If we know what the difficulties are, at least we can watch out for them, whether we're readers or writers. And those are the questions I'd like to explore. I know that most people here probably know a lot about Lawrence, but nevertheless I would like quickly to resume his life because it's relevant to what I'll say later. His father was Sir Thomas Chapman, an Irish nobleman from a distinguished family. Married with 4 daughters, Thomas fell in love with his daughter's governess. When the affair was discovered, they eloped, leaving the family and its estates behind in Ireland, although Chapman still received some income. The unmarried couple adopted the name Lawrence, and they had 5 sons. They lived for a while in France to avoid the risk of recognition in scandal. Then in 1894 they quietly moved back to England. 2 years later they bought a house in North Oxford where the boys grew up. Thomas Edward was the second son. His adult height was about 167 centimetres. He was fair-haired with a head that seems disproportionately large. He had a soft, low-pitched voice, penetrating blue eyes, an iron will, and an innate quality of leadership. The novelist and statesman John Buchan, who didn't know Lawrence particularly well, later wrote, "I would have followed Lawrence over the edge of the world," and that kind of statement is echoed elsewhere. Lawrence won an exhibition, which is a sort of small scholarship, to Jesus College, Oxford, graduating in 1910 with first-class honours in history. By then he was deeply interested in the medieval world and had already travelled in the Middle East. Between 1911 and 1914 he worked at the British Museum's excavations at Carchemish, a Hittite city now on the frontier of Turkey and Syria. Then came the war. Late in 1914 he was sent, as Henri has reminded us, to the intelligence staff in Cairo, where his knowledge of Arabic and the Middle East would be useful. In the autumn of 1916, he went down to the Hejaz to gather information about the revolt by the Arabs against the Turks, which had begun with British assistance, and no surprise to Lawrence, 4 months earlier. Afterwards, Lawrence served as a British liaison officer with the Arab forces until October 1918. You've heard a lot about that this morning. In 1919, he attended the Paris Peace Conference, attached to the Hejaz delegation, though nominally part of the British delegation. During 1921-2, he was advisor on Arab affairs to Winston Churchill, then Secretary of State for the Colonies. He played a significant, but not, I would say, determining role in the 1921 settlements under which Iraq became a kingdom and Hashemite rule was established in Jordan. During this period of post-war diplomacy, he also wrote 3 successive drafts of 7 Pillars of Wisdom, a lengthy account of his experiences during the revolt. By the summer of 1922, war, diplomacy, and the strain of writing Seven Pillars had taken their toll. Lawrence suffered from a mental breakdown, call it what you will. Seeking a temporary haven, as he put it, some modern equivalent to the monastery, he enlisted in the ranks of the RAF under a false name. He soon found that service life suited him. In exchange for little effort, all his needs were met. I'm fit, and the sort of job I do doesn't worry me, since the only adventures and interests I have are in my head, and the army leaves all your thinking time to yourself. He remained in the ranks until February 1935. During that time, he revised and published a private subscription edition of Seven Pillars, wrote a second book, The Mint, translated a short novel from French, and Homer's Odyssey from Greek. He also read avidly. His main literary activity, though, was writing letters. He corresponded with numerous writers, artists, and members of the political elite. In May 1935, a few weeks after completing his term of enlistment, he was severely injured in a motorcycle accident. He died 6 days later without regaining consciousness. Both Seven Pillars of Wisdom and his rendering of the Odyssey have been continuously in print since first publication. Seven Pillars in several languages. Several thousand of his letters survive. An increasing number have been published. So much for the outline. What about the biographical sources? There are copious sources for the first half of his career. For example, there are official records of the Carchemish excavations, of the Middle East during World War I, of the Paris Peace Conference, and of his time in the Colonial Office. Throughout his adult life, his letters provide both information and opinion. He once told a friend, "Of course someday someone will want to write a letter of me, and his only source will be such letters as chance had preserved. Had they all been kept, there would probably be a pretty complete history of events since 1910. Volumes of stuff enough to discourage any historian, but chance will narrow his pile down." In the event, a large proportion of his letters did survive, perhaps because they soon became valuable. Lawrence also appears in numerous memoirs. In 1961, Paul Adam, a French economist, wrote, "By a paradox which is not without logic, the very mystery of Lawrence's case has provoked both research and testimony. As a result, we know far more about him than we do about people who were never thought to be mysterious." What could be challenging about that? What follows is drawn from my observations over 40 years while working on Lawrence's authorized biography, then editing his works and letters and moderating the T. Lawrence Studies discussion list. I've grouped the challenges in 7 categories. You could cut the thing lots of other ways, but I've chosen these. Some apply to most areas of biography, others are more specific to Lawrence. First, and perhaps simplest so far as the majority of Lawrence biographers concerned, is there's too much source material. In fact, the scale of the source material is daunting. Nobody hoping to make money from a biography could take the time to read it all. This applies, of course, to many biographical subjects, few more than Winston Churchill. Popular biographers cope with this kind of surfeit in 2 ways. One is to rely on research by other people, already available in books and articles. That, however, can be dangerous. Your book is your reputation. If you stake that on someone else's thoroughness, competence, honesty, and lack of bias, you may one day wish you hadn't. In Lawrence's case, there are plenty of errors of fact and/or interpretation in print, and it's very easy to repeat somebody else's mistake. Journalists use material from press clipping files, and biographers look at previous biographies. Sometimes one can pinpoint the birth of a myth, then follow its progress through later accounts. There are lots of examples of that, and if somebody's interested in one, I'll give it later. Happily, people now use the internet as a research tool, and I think that can help break the vicious circle. They're not relying on what's just been written, they're looking at more general things. One way for a biographer to conceal shallow research, apart from adding a gigantic list of sources, which has become very popular, is akin to archaeological pitting, that is, testing an archaeological site by digging a few holes, each some distance apart. While drawing on published materials for most of your account, you investigate one or two topics in much greater depth. Quoting a few passages not published elsewhere may give your work an air of originality. If that sounds nasty, I think it's nevertheless justified, as most people here will recognize. Unfortunately, in biography as in archaeology, pitting can mislead. The gems you find are hugely outweighed by all the context you've missed. Joining dots that are a long way apart is never sensible. Secondly, Lawrence's career crossed too many fields. Yes, indeed it did. His life was a fairly extreme example of a common research obstacle. To write about him, you need to know at least something, and sometimes a great deal, about medieval English pottery, the design of European crusader castles up to the end of the 12th century, Hittite archaeology, the history, contemporary politics and tribal customs of much of the Middle East, the First World War and many aspects of the Arab Revolt and the campaigns in Palestine, French, British and Government of India's special political desiderata between 1910 and 1922 and their secret negotiations relating to the future of the Middle East, including the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the 1919 Paris Peace Conference and the 1921 Cairo Conference. It's useful, too, to have a reasonable knowledge of what has happened since. You need to understand the practical task Lawrence faced in writing a 335,000-word historical account of the revolt, and to know about life in the ranks of the RAF and Tank Corps in the 1920s and 30s, technical aspects of fine press typesetting, letterpress design, book production, technical aspects of planing hull speedboat design in the 1930s, of contemporary marine engines and even motorcycles, translating from French and Greek into English, and so on. Nobody starting out to write about Lawrence would already be expert in all these fields, so there's a lot to learn. That implies a willingness to learn. Some biographers, while claiming an overall approach, have chosen to set aside what they didn't understand. Their accounts are correspondingly flawed. I'll give just one example. Victoria Ocampo, an Argentinian intellectual and publisher, wrote, "Lawrence was right in thinking that women cannot understand machinery." Her book about him is perceptive and interesting. A.W. Lawrence, Lawrence's younger brother, called it the best portrait. But she found what she called his, quote, voluntary slavery, unquote, in the ranks of the RAF incomprehensible. A related and very real problem is the risk of peripheral errors. You may have thoroughly researched the central story, but it's hard to find time to check every background detail in every peripheral field. I've made such mistakes myself. Peripheral errors may not seem all that important. By definition, they aren't central to your work. But every mistake a reader notices undermines their confidence, and reviewers will love to embarrass you. Third, the academic divide. Because Lawrence's life and interests were so diverse, they cross academic frontiers. No single university department feels it owns more than a small part of his career. Understandably, academics are uneasy about straying outside their specialist field. Hence a fragmented approach and another kind of problem. English literature departments have one set of analytical tools and associated terminology, historians another, psychologists a third. Their arguments and conclusions are obscure to outsiders and sometimes to each other. They're easily misunderstood. An example illustrates the consequences. Literary critics sometimes treat Seven Pillars as though it were fiction, and confidently assume that Lawrence falsified the narrative for greater literary effect, as a novelist would do. Historians, by contrast, test his accounts against independent contemporary sources, and on the whole find it accurate. It deceives by omission, not by invention. So the differing approaches lead to incompatible conclusions. Confronted with such disarray, the public tends to quote the specialist it fancies. Fourth, what kind of biographer are you? In 1927, Lawrence wrote, "In the distant future, if the distant future deigns to consider my insignificance, I shall be appraised rather as a man of letters than a man of action." Hiding behind this statement is something that takes us to a different kind of challenge, perhaps the central challenge of Lawrence's biography. Lawrence became famous as a war hero. From his schoolboy cycling tours up to the capture of Damascus in October 1918, his life can be told as an adventure story with an intriguing lead character. Quote, "Here was a man in whom there existed," unquote, Churchill wrote, "that touch of genius which everyone recognizes and no one can define." In 1922, when Lawrence resigned from the Colonial Office, the world was at his feet. But instead of progressing to greater things, he enlisted in the RAF and went on to spend 12.5 years as a simple serviceman. The decision defied rational explanation for Lawrence, incidentally, as well as his biographers. His contemporaries were shocked. So Lawrence's adult life divides neatly into two halves. From 1910 to August 1922, that is 12 years, we have an adventurous career and, in addition to his letters and 7 pillars, a huge mass of independent source material. For the next 12 years, the remainder of his life, there is hardly any independent source material. Instead, biographers have to draw solely on his own writings, i.e. his second autobiographical book, The Mint, and his letters. The majority of the surviving letters date from this second period. Man-of-action biographers find little of interest in the service years. In popular opinion, the Boy Scout hero had become an eccentric dropout. He lived in barracks, a peacetime serviceman performing repetitive, mundane tasks. Therefore, there were few truly newsworthy events until the motorcycle accident that killed him. For a different type of biographer, though, these service years are the period in which Lawrence's life becomes fascinating. We now enter the realms of biographie intellectuelle and psychological investigation. For these writers, the articulate introspection of his letters provides rich material. This kind of biographical interpretation can be worthwhile, provided it is A, well-informed, and B, well-argued. I stress well-informed because an interpretation of someone's life which is based on factual errors is unlikely to be worth very much. I also stress well-argued. Too often, biographical arguments are flawed because of incorrect assumptions or missing premises. Again, I can give examples if there's time. If these logical elements were stated, they would change or even invalidate the conclusions. To be generous, some writers may not have thought them through, but that's hardly praiseworthy. Other biographers turn to rhetorical persuasion rather than logic. For example, leading readers to a particular conclusion, though other unmentioned conclusions are at least as probable. Here too are rhetorical tactics such as post hoc ergo propter hoc, and there's no smoke without fire, and similar innuendo. An interpretation is the interaction of two minds and two personalities, so biographical interpretations tell us something about their authors. That makes the studies of Lawrence by intellectuals such as Malraux and Ocampo particularly interesting, even if they were based on limited knowledge of his life for historical reasons. It's therefore useful to discover if a biographer has a private agenda. One of the first things I do when I hear of a new book about Lawrence is to check what else the author has written and what reviewers made of it. Given the subjective element in interpretation, we shouldn't expect all interpretations of Lawrence to agree. Thus, some writers, such as Ocampo, see the service years as a time of nihilistic self-denial. His death could even have been suicide. Others, by contrast, believe that following the period of breakdown in 1922 to 1925, he successfully rebuilt his life, chalking up a string of creative achievements such as The Mint, his translation of the Odyssey, and his work developing RAF rescue boats. So we end up with little agreement and many contradictions. To add to the chaos, adventure stories biographers of the first part of his life and interpretative biographers of the second stray into one another's territory, which they may be very ill-equipped to do. Number 5, contentious issues. If the subject of a biography is involved in contentious issues, that can be a challenge which is difficult to deal with. For example, many people believe that the history of the Middle East between 1914 and 1922 contains the root causes of today's problems. Some of them see Lawrence as a central figure. These issues are still burning hot. A century on, accounts of the events, motives, and consequences are still contested. It's a field where historical scholarship may be tainted with modern propaganda. As I know from experience, if you try to establish an objective narrative, you can expect to be fired at from all sides. There is another Middle Eastern polemic that dogs Lawrence's reputation. Arab historians often attack him, irritated that the West credits the success of the Arab revolt to an Englishman. It's not hard to feel some sympathy with them, since most of the men who did the fighting were Arabs. But the records do show that the revolt was supplied and financed by Britain and, to a smaller extent, France. The British GHQ expected its liaison officers, who controlled the flow of assistance, to deliver specific results. Without outside help, including funding, material, the revolt would quickly have foundered. These are not the only contentious issues that affect Lawrence's biography, but they illustrate the problem. Such factors contribute a lot to the continuing confusion. Next, celebrity and its consequences. As Lawrence discovered, celebrity can make life difficult. It can also make life difficult for biographers. I'll list here just a few of the consequences, but I'm sure the list could be longer. Stories about celebrities earn money for writers and publishers. Let's make that absolutely clear. It's the truth. And earning money is more important to these writers and publishers than historical balance or accuracy. But the public doesn't want to read the same story twice. So if a celebrity is to survive, the media need a succession of new stories, new angles on old stories, sensational discoveries, and so on. Media writers stuck for material will sometimes distort or invent. As a result, the original true story, which may be far more remarkable than any of the later editions, has lost its power to earn money. This isn't just in newspapers. This sort of thing gets into popular biographies that sell in tens of thousands. But they aren't necessarily well-researched or balanced or accurate. In Lawrence's case, the process has been going on for 100 years. So unless you stay, in my view, unless you stay close to primary sources, it can be near impossible to discern truth from invention. Likewise, as we heard just now in the case of people living in Wadi Musa, the market for new angles puts pressure on witnesses. They are questioned again and again to see if they can dredge up something that will appear to be new. Memory is fickle, and often over time stories change. It's extraordinary how much witnesses, people who were there, will actually tell a different story over the next 20 years. Offered money, a lot of people will simply invent. Checkbook journalism. Celebrities attract hagiographers and, in their wake, iconoclasts. The admiring biographies of Lawrence by Lowell Thomas, Robert Graves, and Liddell Hart, all written in his lifetime, were an easy target for Richard Aldington's subsequent attack, which I think would have come sooner but for the Second World War, which intervened. More recently, John Mack's major biography, Mine, and a new selection of Lawrence's letters, all published between 1976 and 1989, provoked a succession of controversial biographies. In the quest for novelty, the media build up celebrities, then hack them down. Both activities can pay handsomely. Richard Aldington's advance for his hatchet job on Lawrence earned a £10,000 payment from the publisher, which would be the equivalent to £230,000 today. Lawrence's reputation has been up and down this roller coaster several times, each cycle adding to the legend. The blame here lies much more with publishers than writers. I expected my 1,200-page biography to be followed by shorter accounts for a wider public, but for a long time afterwards nobody would publish a balanced account. Publishers argued, "You haven't said anything Mack and Wilson didn't cover. We want something new." The audience for popular journalism, including TV audience, wants simple explanations. Lawrence did X because of Y, not because of A, B, C, and possibly D and or E. In real life, almost no decision has simple causes. If you doubt me, choose a decision of your own and think through all the elements that contributed to it. Oversimplified media explanations don't just stick in the mind, they obstruct any explanation closer to the truth. Next, dramas, plays and film scripts distort celebrity even further. At one point, I was historical advisor to a projected Hollywood TV miniseries. That gave me many insights into the problem. It's unlikely we could ever get accurate history from a screen drama, which is disturbing because screen drama can be so influential. I was once interviewed, together with an American expert on the Middle East, by a major American radio station. It soon became clear that the interviewer had based all his questions on David Lean's film. Next, if you wish to attract attention, invoking a celebrity name is useful. I've seen countless articles in which Lawrence was cited, often on some absurdly contrived pretext, just to get attention. This applies especially to polemics about the Middle East. Irrelevant distractions of that kind just add to the confusion. Next, you notice that celebrity legends are cumulative, so their early characteristics tend to last. Lawrence first attracted a journalist's attention in 1918 while he was fighting behind enemy lines. For his safety, the people who knew what he was doing and where he was wouldn't talk. Lowell Thomas, the American war correspondent who wanted his story, had a struggle to get much information. Right from the start, therefore, Lawrence's story was branded mysterious, and a century later, that's still part of the legend. In 1922, when the press discovered that he had enlisted in the ranks, he became enigmatic. That too has stuck. In 1955, 60 years ago, Richard Aldington attacked the early hagiographers. Ever since, Lawrence has been controversial. So there you have your three qualities: mysterious, enigmatic, and controversial. They all have historical roots. The British wartime and diplomatic documents, as Henri has said, were released in the 1960s, and his papers in the Bodleian Library in 2000. There is no longer much mystery about his wartime or diplomatic roles, or won't be when researchers have finished exploring every nook and cranny. The reasons for his enlistment are complex, but hardly enigmatic. The evidence we now have sweeps aside most of the Aldington controversy, as well as the hagiography that provoked it. So I feel that most of that is in the past. Last thought about this topic. It seems to me that national taste seems to affect the treatment of celebrities. For example, in 1968, it became known that Lawrence had suffered from what John Mack, a Harvard professor of psychiatry, called a flagellation disorder. He very occasionally arranged to have himself beaten. For the next 20 years, the British press refused to print printed Lawrence stories focused on sadomasochism. In fact, they really wouldn't print stories about anything else. That, for the British press, was Lawrence, and it was a topic that they thought sold. Curiously, or perhaps not curiously, the revelation had far less effect in America, where psychology is more popular, and I think almost none in France, nor I think the rest of continental Europe. I was asked about this by an Australian broadcaster, and I said I thought that the French had probably discovered sex before the British, and this was why they weren't so excited about it. The French were always more attracted by Biographie intellectuelle and, of course, the history of the Middle East. Indeed, some of the most thought-provoking studies of Lawrence have been written in France. 7, the last of my categories, the things we don't know. You may have worked out that my title, 2/3 of a Life, refers to one level of Lawrence's enigma. Many in his generation, including himself in letters, expected to live until 70. Lawrence died at 46, just 2/3 of the way there. However, the title also seems apposite on another level. Despite everything we know about the first half of Lawrence's life, and despite all his introspective writings, some of the key elements we would expect to find in a modern biography are lacking. For example, we don't know for sure what he knew about his family background during his formative years, though we do know he discussed it with his mother after his father's death in 1919. One source suggests he thought Mr. Lawrence was not the father of himself or his elder brother, though he was the father of the younger boys. That would have been a reasonable deduction, given the usual fate of servants made pregnant by aristocratic employers. From letters, we know that Lawrence was always conscious of his illegitimate birth. Brought up as an evangelical Christian, he would have known the likely consequences had the fact ever become public. But we can't tell how much that affected early decisions about a career, nor his later decision to enlist. We can just observe that he chose to spend most of his life in contexts where disclosure could not seriously harm him. We can't tell either whether illegitimacy affected his thinking about marriage. After the war he was famous and, with a good post in the civil service, highly eligible. There was at the time a shortage of eligible men because so many had died on the Western Front. But few respectable families would in those days have welcomed the social disgrace of a son-in-law who turned out to be illegitimate. There was a girl, a friend of the family, whom Lawrence was very keen on at Oxford. We know that from independent testimony. As it happens, she was the daughter of a bankrupt, another disgraced category. Many years later, she told Lawrence's biographer John Mack that Lawrence had proposed to her in 1910, shortly after graduating. She had refused him because she preferred his taller younger brother Will, who was killed in action in 1915. She became engaged to another man, and we know that Lawrence was present at their wedding. He also gave her £3,000, then an enormous sum, inherited from his father. But we know very little else. Also in Seven Pillars, Lawrence describes his capture and maltreatment by the Turks at Dera in November 1917, after which he managed to escape. It is clear from private letters that he was raped. British readers found, and some still find, his account of this episode gratuitous and unsavoury. Some writers have tried to prove it didn't happen. I have my own theory about Lawrence's reason for including the episode in Seven Pillars, but I have little doubt that it happened. Other cultures have been slow to accept that male rape of war prisoners is widespread in the Middle East and some parts of Africa. Recent research shows that it was and is fairly commonplace. Despite endless research and speculation, no one has found reliable evidence that Lawrence ever had a sexual relationship. There are at least 4 possible explanations for this abstinence. These could have influenced him singly or in combination. First, it could be that his pride never got over the rejection at Oxford in 1910. In some ways, Lawrence took himself extremely seriously. He would not be the only man to avoid risking a second refusal. Secondly, wartime experience of violent rape may have left him with a horror of sexual intercourse. There is evidence in his letters to support that. Thirdly, knowledge of his family and his difficult relationship with his strong-willed mother may, as John Mack concluded and Lawrence's letters suggest, have barred him from all thought of marriage or having children. Fourthly, he could have been a suppressed homosexual. But while Lawrence did not judge other people's relationships, he had both heterosexual and homosexual friends, he himself displayed little inclination in either direction. When E.M. Forster offered him opportunities to meet other homosexuals, he politely declined. He read 1 or 2 of Forster's unpublishable stories and made detailed comments on their writing technique, but to Forster's puzzlement, he refused to read Maurice, which was Forster's homosexual novel, never published in Forster's lifetime. I've tried as hard as anyone to reach a conclusion about this, since so many people now regard sexuality as a key to understanding someone's life. But I see no adequate grounds for a conclusion. In law, there's a concept of due diligence, meaning the reasonable investigation someone should make before reaching a decision. I think the same principle ought to be applied in biography. If, after diligent research, you still know too little to be certain, then you should leave the question open. In the long run, more evidence may turn up, and it may then turn out that a guess you published was wrong. My purpose in this talk was to explore the causes of continuing biographical conclusion so long after Lawrence's death. Having done so, my main conclusion is that the confusion will continue for a long time, if not indefinitely. In the 1930s, biographers were puzzled by mystery and enigma about his wartime achievements, and enlistments. Today's biographers are published by the mystery and enigma about his personal life. What has, I think, been achieved in recent years is a much more solid understanding of the historical facts. Also, much more of the primary source material is now available, both in print and online. It's encouraging that the academic world is now sympathetic to interdepartmental collaboration, in which lies, in my view, the only possible hope of an overall understanding of Lawrence's life by the academic community. As long as intellectual biographers are attracted to Lawrence's life, we can expect differing interpretations, and that can be extremely interesting. As a biographer, I myself would say, or as a biographer with an interest in the wider history, I myself would say that the great challenge of what lies ahead is to achieve some common ground between British and Arab historians. And there I think there's quite a long path to walk. And I think that a solution to which I would like to contribute if I live long enough is to put a lot of the documents in the National Archives and French archives online, where Arab historians can actually read them rather than having to travel at huge expense, distant libraries, and spend years looking for things. Suleiman Musa once told me that you could spend a lifetime in the public record office and the day you died you'd find something new, and I think that's true. That's it.